Welcome to our deep dive into the world of women's rights in the UK. We're going to be taking a look at how things have changed since that pivotal year, 1918, a year that saw some women finally win the right to vote.
It was a huge milestone,
Yeah.
but it really was just one step on a much longer road.
Exactly. And it makes you think about how much the idea of equality itself has evolved over the past century, right?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And to get a sense of that evolution, we're going to be drawing on a variety of sources for this deep dive. Historical accounts, legal documents, data on women's representation in politics and business, and even perspectives from modern feminist movements.
Wow, that's a lot to cover. But let's start by rewinding back to 1918. The Representation of the People Act is passed, and some women get the vote. But not all women.
Right.
You had to be over 30 and a property owner to qualify. Can you imagine that restriction today?
It's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, do you think this property requirement was really about a stake in society, like some claimed at the time? Or was it a way to limit women's political participation from the get-go?
It's tricky to disentangle those motives, for sure. There was definitely a prevailing view back then that property ownership equaled a certain level of independence and therefore the right to have a say in government.
Okay, so they believed that if you owned property, you were more likely to make responsible decisions.
Right. Exactly. But it's also undeniable that this property requirement excluded a huge swath of women, particularly working-class women, who were less likely to own property.
So was it really about fairness, or was it about control?
It certainly makes you wonder.
It almost makes you wonder if those who crafted the law knew exactly what they were doing. It's not like they were unaware of the economic realities for most women at the time.
Yeah, it's certainly a point worth considering. And even for those women who technically qualified to vote, not all of them chose to participate.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Take the case of Constance Markievicz. She was the first woman elected to the House of Commons, but she refused to take her seat.
Wow. Talk about making a statement. I mean,
Yeah,
can you
sure.
imagine the audacity?
Well, she was a member of Sinn Féin and a staunch advocate for Irish independence. To her, participating in the British Parliament would have felt like legitimizing a system she fundamentally opposed.
So for her, it was a matter of principle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And her actions really highlight how the fight for women's suffrage wasn't just about getting a tick on a ballot paper. It was deeply intertwined with other social and political movements of the time.
So it was about something bigger.
Exactly. The suffragettes, for example, were incredibly savvy at linking their cause to broader ideas of justice and equality.
They really were. They understood that to achieve lasting change, they had to challenge the entire power structure, not just a single piece of legislation. And these women were willing to put everything on the line, organizing marches, staging protests, even enduring imprisonment.
They were fearless.
Their tactics were diverse, but their commitment was unwavering.
And their efforts, along with the work of countless others, eventually led to some major legal milestones. I mean, we can't talk about women's rights in the UK without mentioning the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 and the Equality Act of 2010.
Huge steps forward in terms of legislation.
Right. These acts aim to dismantle discrimination in areas like employment education and the provision of goods and services. On paper, it was a huge step forward, finally making it illegal to treat someone differently based on their gender.
That's incredible when you think about it.
But, as with any legislation, the devil is in the details. So the question is, did these acts fully achieve what they set out to do?
So that's what we'll be discussing next.
Exactly. For instance, the Sex Discrimination Act included provisions for equal pay, but did it actually close the gender pay gap?
Good point.
And while the Equality Act brought together various pieces of equality legislation, did it create any unintended consequences or loopholes that might have been exploited?
These are all questions worth exploring.
Absolutely. As we dive deeper into the complexities of this journey.
I can't wait.
Yeah, this is going to be fascinating.
You know, it's interesting how those legal milestones you mentioned kind of force us to think about the difference between equality on paper and equality in practice. I mean, passing a law is one thing, but changing deeply ingrained societal attitudes and structures, that's a whole other battle.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And one area where that battle has played out very visibly is in the realm of politics. You know, in 1918, the year we started this deep dive, there were barely any women in Parliament.
Right, like a handful at most.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But fast forward to 2023, and we hit a record high with 40% of MPs being women. Plus, let's not forget, we've had two female prime ministers, Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May. On the surface, that seems like a huge shift.
It does, but it also makes me wonder, is 40% enough? I mean, statistically, women make up roughly half the population, right? So shouldn't their representation in government reflect that?
That's a good question. And that's where the idea of descriptive versus substantive representation comes in. Having women in office doesn't automatically guarantee that their voices and interests are truly being represented. It's about more than just numbers.
So it's not just about having women in those seats, it's about making sure they actually have the power to make a difference.
Exactly. We need to ask deeper questions. Like, are these women coming from diverse backgrounds? Do they hold positions of real power and influence? Are they able to champion policies that genuinely benefit women?
Yeah, those are the things that really matter in the end. And it makes me think about the experiences of women of color in politics. Have they faced even greater barriers to entry and advancement?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
The path of political power has not been equal for all women.
Right.
Women of color often face intersecting forms of discrimination based on their gender, their race, and sometimes even their class or religion.
So the fight for equality is even more complex for them.
It is. It's a reminder that the fight for equality is multifaceted. It's about dismantling systems of oppression on all fronts.
Right. And speaking of systems, it's impossible to talk about women's equality without talking about work and the economy. Back in 1918, career options for women were severely limited, things like teaching, nursing, domestic service. But then World War I came along and shook things up. Suddenly, with men away, fighting women stepped into traditionally male roles in factories, on farms, even in transportation.
It was a real turning point.
Yeah.
And, those wartime experiences had a lasting impact on how women viewed their own capabilities and their place in society.
So it wasn't just about filling a gap, it was about changing perceptions.
Exactly. It planted a seed, a questioning of those traditional gender roles that had been so deeply ingrained for generations.
So was that shift permanent?
Sadly, no. After the war ended, there was a societal push to return to the status quo. Many women were encouraged or even pressured to go back to their domestic roles, making way for the returning soldiers.
Oh, wow. So it's like a step forward and then a step back.
It was. It's a stark example of how quickly progress can be reversed when deeply held beliefs about gender and work are challenged.
It also shows how economic structures can reinforce those societal norms. If the prevailing views is that a man should be the breadwinner and a woman the homemaker, then policies and practices are likely to reflect that.
Precisely. And even today, we see echoes of those historical patterns. I mean, the gender pay gap, for example, is a persistent problem. Women, on average, still earn less than men for doing the same work.
It's crazy that we're still dealing with that in the 21st century.
I know. And underrepresentation in leadership positions is another issue. While we've seen some progress, women are still far less likely than men to hold CEO roles, board seats, or other top positions across various industries.
And then there's the ongoing issue of sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace. It's a reminder that even when laws are in place, changing attitudes and behaviors can be a much slower and more complex process.
It's true. And sometimes it feels like these problems we're seeing today are just echoes of past inequalities, just manifesting in new and sometimes more subtle ways.
It makes you wonder if those early suffragettes could see us now, would they be cheering us on or shaking their heads in disappointment?
That's a powerful question to consider. And it leads us into the realm of modern feminist movements. The fight for equality didn't end with the vote or with those landmark legal victories. It continues to evolve and adapt to the challenges of our time.
Right. Fourth wave feminism and beyond. It's about recognizing that the fight for women's rights is intersectional, meaning it can't be separated from other forms of oppression based on race, class, sexual orientation, disability, and so on. It's about fighting for a truly just and equitable world for everyone.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating about these modern movements is how they're using new tools and strategies. Social media, for example, has become a powerful platform for raising awareness, mobilizing support, and holding individuals and institutions accountable.
You're right. Groups like UK Feminista, which is doing incredible work to understand and combat contemporary sexism, or the Everyday Sexism Project, which provides a space for women to share their experiences of discrimination. They're harnessing the power of technology to create real change.
They really are. And it's a reminder that even small actions can make a difference. Speaking up when you see injustice, challenging harmful stereotypes, supporting organizations that are fighting for equality. These things all contribute to a more just and equitable society.
It's about recognizing that this isn't just women's work, it's everyone's work.
Exactly. And that brings us back to where we started in 1918, those early suffragettes and their vision for a better future. What would they think of the world we live in today?
You know, it's just incredible to think about how much has changed in just over a century. I mean, we've gone from a time when women couldn't even vote to a time when they're leading countries, running major corporations, making their voices heard on a global stage.
Yeah.
But as we've seen, that progress hasn't been a straight line, you know?
Right? Not at all. And it's important to remember that progress isn't inevitable. It takes constant vigilance activism, a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One thing that really stood out to me while we were preparing for this deep dive was the sheer determination of the women who came before us. They faced incredible opposition, societal pressure, even imprisonment. But they just refused to give up on their vision of a more just and equitable world.
It's truly inspiring. Their courage and resilience, they understood that change doesn't happen overnight. It's a long and often arduous process. But every step forward, no matter how small it might seem, brings us closer to that vision.
And that's where we come in, right? We're the inheritors of that legacy. It's up to us to carry the torch and continue the fight for equality in our own time.
Absolutely. And I think those early suffragettes would be both proud of how far we've come and deeply concerned about the challenges that remain. The gender pay gap, underrepresentation in leadership, persistent sexism, and discrimination. These are all issues that demand our attention and action.
You know what I find really encouraging, though, is the growing awareness of these issues and the increasing number of people, both women and men, who are committed to addressing them.
That's crucial. This is just a women's issue. It's a societal issue that impacts all of us. When women are held back, we all lose out on their talent, perspectives, contributions.
Couldn't agree more. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of women's rights in the UK, I want to leave our listeners with this question. What will your role be in shaping the next chapter of this story?
What actions, big or small, can you take to challenge inequality and create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive? Maybe it's speaking up when you hear a sexist joke, or maybe it's supporting organizations that are fighting for women's rights.
It's about recognizing that we all have a part to play in building a more just and equitable world. Thanks for joining us on this journey through time. And remember, the fight for equality is far from over. It's an ongoing process that requires our continued attention and commitment.